What you're seeing here is called a quad jump, and it's one of the most rotationally demanding activities in sports. And the way she generates enough rotational power to get 4 times around like this is really instructive for us as tennis players. So we're going to learn from her power position and the way she drives from that power position, which is very similar to what tennis players do because we're all trying to create rotational power. But her goal is to spin, whereas our goal is to create the highest velocity linear strike we can. So after we talk about that power position and explain how she generates so much rotational force from this position, then we're going to go talk about the differences with what tennis players do because we want to create that linear strike as opposed to a figure skater using their power to spin. We have to start with the somewhat misleading idea that power comes from the ground. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch this loading and drive phase 2 times through. First, I want you to watch her shoulder line. So watch the way she uses that shoulder line, bam, to initiate that rotation. Let's watch it again. As she skates in, she winds up those shoulders. And then here during this early part of the drive phase, she throws those shoulders into the rotation. So that is a trunk-driven movement where the shoulders are thrown into rotation and that commands the rest of the body to go into rotation. But I want you to watch the way that her legs and the rhythm of her legs loading during this phase. Watch the shoulders and the legs, watch this timing sequence. Those shoulders are being thrown out while the legs are still loading up. And so this is why the idea that power comes from the ground, even though it's literally true, it can often be misleading because the command for your rotational movement comes from your trunk and not from your legs. Your legs are a force multiplier. They are the strongest force multiplier you have. All of the strongest muscles in your body are between here and here, the hips, the hamstrings, all the muscles in and around the knee and in and around the pelvis. Those are your strongest muscles. And without that force multiplier, you'll never be able to generate enough rotational power to do something like this. But it is a force multiplier. The root cause of the force is watch that shoulder line. Even before the legs have fired, even before the legs are fully loaded, those shoulders are commanding the body to rotate. And so the mental model for generating rotational power is rotate with your trunk. The reason that her brain tells her legs, hey, bend and fire, is because her trunk is commanding her body to spin like this. So that mental command, I want to spin as fast as I can, that mental command executes itself first and foremost at the trunk. And then the legs are recruited as a force multiplier on that motion. And so what happens here is the trunk is firing out, and then when the legs fire here and we recruit the hips and the quads and all those really strong muscles, specifically in the right side of the body here, now the trunk hits peak velocity here, now that we've gotten that force multiplication from the legs and from the ground, but the intention of the motion starts well before the legs get involved, and the intention of the motion doesn't really involve the legs. It is the force multiplication that demands the legs. So again, one more time, watch the sequencing between the upper body, which is pulling out here, commanding rotation here, and the lower body, which is still loading up there, and then force multiplies the intention from the trunk. So with the figure skater, we can really see the trunk initiating the motion, the pulse of power from the hips, and then the continued resulting rotation of the trunk. In tennis, everything is so compact and mushed together. It's really hard to see, but I'm going to try to show you here. So watch the left arm and left shoulder of Carlos Alcaraz. Right here. So this initial intention of the swing is trunk driven. Those shoulders, that upper part of the trunk, is the first thing to command the body to rotate. Now, if you look at the hip here, I'm going to show you the part where it explosively straightens there. So right here, watch that right leg. Right here, that right leg explosively straightens to add that power pulse to the rotation right here. But look at where his trunk is. His trunk starts here, and it's here at the power pulse. So again, with the figure skater, we have a long, visible arm motion before that power pulse from the hips. In tennis, because everything is so compact, the sequence still exists, but it's so hard to see. And so if you watch the hips right here, the hips max velocity right here. But the hips aren't rotating nearly as far as the trunk. So if we look at the trunk here, it's facing the camera, maybe even a little back from the camera, whereas the hips are like 45 degrees back instead of 90 degrees or more than that back. And then the trunk starts, Power pulse from the hips right there. That's the force multiplier. That's when people say power comes from the ground. It's because without this little pulse from the hips, the swing gets so much slower. But if you watch the trunk rotating, power pulse from the hips, trunk still rotating. So that sequence, the trunk that starts behind the hips and it ends in front of the hips. So even in tennis where everything is so compact, the hips are a power pulse in the middle of your rotation that speeds it up. So we are still fundamentally commanding the shoulder line, the upper part of the trunk to rotate. And the hips, they hear that command and they go, okay, sure, bam, I'm going to forcibly straighten right around here. And that's going to add tons of power to that rotation. And to go back to the figure skater quickly, so watch her shoulders. It's this long shoulder-driven motion. And here, because it's a lot less compact, we can really see that the hips fire a pulse right here, well in the middle of that command from the upper body. So the command from the upper body to rotate starts here. Those shoulders are starting in here, and the hips load, 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 fire here. Now in tennis, this whole thing gets mushed together, and that's what we're going to talk about next, how we get this spinning rotational power, and we translate it into a really quick, compact pulse through and through, so we can create a linear swing. But before we get to that, we just have to get the fundamentals that even though we're going to make it more compact and tight, the fundamental sequencing where the trunk commands and then the hips force multiply, that's got to stay. And I think because tennis is so compact, a lot of people in the process of trying to make it compact or trying to imitate what they see from compact swings, they lose the trunk command followed by the force multiplication. They lose that acceleration rhythm, and that's where things get so slow and awkward feeling. So right now you should be thinking, okay, coach, but how the heck am I going to time a hip pulse in the middle of the swing? Of course, that's ridiculous. So we need a better mental model than actually what's happening biomechanically. And here's what we do. Watch Federer's left shoulder here. What happens to a lot of people is they visualize pulling their left shoulder to here and rotating to here, right? So you watch it on TV, you see people swing, and you think, okay, start here, end here, so obviously I'm supposed to rotate from here to here, right? No, actually not. Now that we remember, the trunk guides the hips, and then the hips are that real power pulse of the rotation, now we can do a more insightful mental model of how this works. So watch now, don't watch the upper body, just watch the hips. Loaded, loaded, loaded. Now remember, right here, the upper body is preparing the swing. The upper body's already started swinging, but the hips haven't fired yet. Pulse. And now the hips are done. So that's the real key here, is once we're looking at now the hip pulse, we see that the swing really is only from here to here. And this is the big difference with the tennis player and the figure skater, is we're going to go look at her shoulder in a second, but she's not firing her hip pulse when her shoulder is here. She's firing her hip pulse much, much later into that upper body's command. And so what you want to visualize is this as your goal position. So right here, a lot of times I refer to this as the kind of the press slot, because right here you kind of want to visualize that at this point of your swing, it's your arm taking over the swing. And so you're just trying to throw the racket into here with as much velocity as possible. You're not trying to rotate from here to here. Because actually, if you try to rotate to here, your hips are going to end up firing way too late, and you're going to end up spinning instead of doing what we want in tennis, which is that quick rotational pulse and then linear finish. So if we watch right here, watch the left shoulder. That left shoulder getting faster, 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 but the max velocity of that upper body is right here. From here to contact, that trunk is actually going to slow a little, and the arm takes over. Notice how the trunk doesn't rotate that much through here, even though it's rotating like crazy through here. And the reason is that hip pulse is right through here. So the hip pulse is right through here, and that is the real key to generating rotational power, is that a lot of this upper body trunk rotation is not actually power production per se, it's guiding the hips to get that pulse right through the ball. And this is why the most efficient version of the swing often feels like throwing your hip into the ball or throwing your hip behind the ball, is because that's kind of what's happening. If you go here, the trunk guides the hips in, and then that pulse is really throwing the racket behind the ball, and then the racket flicks through the ball. So this is the real mental switch, is instead of imagining the swing as rotating from here to here, Imagine the swing is rotating from here to here. And then the rest of what happens is just the chest taking over and a bunch of natural consequences of powerfully rotating to here. But think of this position as the end goal of your rotation, and that's going to sync up your hip power to create that whip on the end rather than spinning like the figure skater. So when you command your body to spin, you're naturally going to rotate your shoulders farther, 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 farther. Look how far that upper body has rotated. She's almost in like a tennis follow-through position here, and when her hips start to fire, and that's how she creates this spin. A tennis player would be, the hips would have already finished firing right here. Maybe right here. The hips would already be done firing. The hips would be straight, that butt angle would be straight, and she would have fired into the shot. So that's the difference in sequence, and that's why a lot of you guys struggle with over-rotation and why you guys struggle with spinning around, is you're doing more like what the figure skater does, where her goal, her like mental goal for where to pull that left shoulder to is probably there. So she's probably visualizing pulling her left shoulder out to here and trying to get max velocity out right through here. Whereas a tennis player would be trying to get max velocity right through here. And if you're visualizing trying to get max velocity right through here, that is going to naturally cause your brain to command your hips to fire through here. And so that's why the figure skater can spin, and she's using all the same muscles. She's using the hips, she's using the shoulders and the trunk to create rotation, but she spins because she's commanding that hip to fire here by trying to get her velocity to max out here, and you create the linear force by trying to get your max velocity here, and so your hips are naturally going to fire there.